On somewhat of a whim, I decided to join the conversation and read the first Crescent City book, The House of Earth and Blood, in anticipation of the release of the series' third book scheduled for the end of the month, to find out for myself why this series is so contentious. I'll be discussing the good, the bad, and the ugly of Crescent City 1 in this mostly spoiler-free review. My first experience with Sarah J. Maas was through her prolific A Court of Thorns and Roses series, which left me feeling a bit I found myself somewhere in the middle of this spectrum between the readers whose lives were completely changed by the series and those who felt like the books were the worst books that they had ever read. The series was fine, but problematic. Overall, I could see the mass appeal, even if it didn't end up being one of my favorites. And if I can say anything for certain, it's that SJM has a chokehold on certain sections of the internet book community. You really can't escape her popularity. So even without seeking it out, I've picked up that Crescent City, the series, is divisive even amongst the fans. So I read this book in about a week. The story is about a half-human, half-fae named Bryce, who lives in this urban fantasy metropolis called Crescent City. This is SJM's take on adult fantasy, whereas her Throne of Glass series was young adult and her ACOTAR series was new adult. There are a variety of beings in the world of Crescent City to include angels, demons, fairies, and some lesser creatures like sprites, as well as these messenger otters that deliver messages like pigeons. It was definitely giving some Zootopia vibes at times. Bryce reluctantly joins forces with this fallen angel named Hunt to investigate these murders that are plaguing the city. Hunt is enslaved to the archangels, and he's employed by them as their assassin, and he's infamously known as the Shadow of Death. As their investigation progresses, they discover that the murders are just the tip of the iceberg of the looming threat to their city. I want to start off talking about what the book did well. A lot of my criticisms of ACOTAR were either fixed or improved upon in Crescent City to include more diversity and representation, more complex characters who had more believable motivations, and overall more likability. Hunt is described as being tan with dark angular eyes, so in my personal headcanon, I casted him as Asian. The quality of the prose was improved and overall less distracting to me, although far from perfect, with M-dashes, ellipses, and barking bones still making guest appearances throughout. I found Bryce and Hunt's dynamic to be genuinely romantic and tender, and lacking the toxicity of other ships in the SJM universe. They become friends first, which probably puts their relationship in more of that slow burn category, but it worked for me. While both of the story leads are imperfect and imperfect towards each other, the MMC doesn't assault the FMC at any point, so why is the bar always in hell? Something that surprised me in this book was how central female friendship was to the story, to the point where it eclipsed the romantic relationship in plot importance. And ultimately, I love that about this book. This female friendship is something that I felt like was lacking in the ACOTAR series. Motivation beyond just, I'm in love and my romantic relationship is more important than anything else. While the book focuses on one major friendship, I found the minor friendships that were made along the way and present throughout to be more developed than in her previous series, and overall were more endearing. Without spoiling too much, but please skip ahead like 20-30 seconds if you don't want to hear it, there was one character sacrifice in the third act of the book that actually brought me to genuine tears. So I'm a crier, I've always been a crier, but if I'm being honest, crying over a Sarah J. Maas book was not on my bingo card for this read. The history, the lore, the politics in this book were all interesting to me, and it felt like SJM put a lot of time and effort into creating this world, and I appreciated that. When it comes to the execution of the world building, though, this leads me to what this book didn't do quite so well for me. The bad. Let's talk about the bad. The world building of this book was a masterclass on info dumping, like hundreds and hundreds of pages of info dumping. This book was about 800 pages long, and I just felt like it didn't have to be that long. This criticism about the length and the pacing of the book is one of the most consistent and reoccurring that I've seen, and it's usually coupled with the statement that the book doesn't actually get good until about 500 pages in. And ACOTAR does this too, to some extent, especially in the first book, where it feels like about 80% of the way in, Sarah J. pulls up in a car and is like, get in, bitch, we're going on a wild ride. And so much is crammed into that last 20%. While my reading experience overall wasn't as boring as I thought it would be based on some of the feedback I got before even going into this story, I do see where a lot of people are coming from, and it's my belief that most people will feel this way, that the beginning is too boring, too long, and there's just not enough going on. For me though, I'm the kind of person that can spend hours diving into the detailed lore and history of different sort of universes, so it didn't bother me that much, but I mean, I definitely noticed it. So the book is written in this third-person, all-knowing sort of narrator, which I prefer for stories like this. And again, one of my criticisms of ACOTAR was being stuck in Feyre's head for like half of the series. In Crescent City, the third-person POV is mostly fine, but you know, there were some scenes where it felt like we were jumping around perspectives and it was confusing and unnecessary for the story. While I liked the romance overall, I would have liked it more without the vulgar descriptions of various characters' specific attributes. This maybe had about 1.5 sort of spicy scenes, but nothing full on. I don't need smut, I can appreciate a slow burn romance, but the detailed descriptions of breasts and asses just felt kind of incongruent with the type of romance this book seemed like it was trying to be. That sort of thing kind of fits the vibes of a more smuttier fiction like ACOTAR, right? And I don't know if she was trying to do this to keep the interest of those types of dedicated readers who maybe came to this book from ACOTAR and was expecting that level of smut, but it didn't really fit the vibes of this book. In the same vein was the gratuitous use of profanities. I mean, the F-bomb was dropped more than 500 times, and the book just didn't need that. It seemed a bit of a crutch. The thing was already too long. Just by removing some of those profanities and other sort of repetitive words and phrasings, I just think that we could have really cut down and gotten to the actual point. And now we are going to talk about the ugly, or what was problematic about this book. With it being urban fantasy, the line between fantasy and real life inspiration gets a little bit blurry. Crescent City and its citizens are subject to racism, sexism, classism, colonization, and slavery, which is ambitious at best and problematic at worst when it's not handled well. This is the first book of the series, so while the final verdict on the overall message of the story isn't yet solidified, I'd be lying if I said that I wasn't at least a bit apprehensive of where Sarah J. Maas plans on taking these concepts, in particular when it comes to the oppressed versus the oppressors. There were instances in this book where it felt like certain characters were unnecessarily punching down, and I just don't really like that. Drug addiction was another element in the story that I just felt like wasn't handled with a lot of sensitivity or nuance, and I guess I'm just torn about how much leeway to give with it being fantasy when it's clear that certain elements are direct parallels to our real world. Because I finished the book only yesterday, I'm still sort of processing my thoughts about the more problematic aspects of this book, and I just thought it would be important to include in this review for those who are also sensitive to these sorts of issues. Now that we've gone over the good, the bad, and the ugly of this book, I want to take some time to talk about why I think this book is so divisive, and I largely think it comes down to audience. While it's marketed as an adult fantasy, the info dumping, the execution of the world building, and the voice just overall still being Sarah J. Maas-esque, I just feel like a lot of dedicated fantasy readers aren't going to jive with those parts of the story. Conversely, having read ACOTAR and now this book, I can see why it makes some of those fans unhappy, right? The sheer length and depth of the book, coupled with the lack of smut and the romance being more of a subplot, is probably unappealing to a more typical romantic fantasy reader, which is what I would classify ACOTAR as. With ACOTAR being the more popular of the two series, I can see people starting there, coming to this one, and subsequently being disappointed that they aren't more similar. I also think that urban fantasy sometimes can be a harder sell than typical fantasy, especially for those looking for a fantastical escape. And maybe the Crescent City series mirrors too much of our own real world to be that sort of escape. I think for me though, the story mostly worked because I'm not loyal to any one genre, and because I don't mind backstory and rabbit holes, and I'm a fast reader, so even some of those more info dumpy parts I can get through rather quickly. I also have a special interest in mystery and crime stories, and in many ways Crescent City had appealed to that. These things are specific to me though, right? And I think that's why I would only selectively recommend it, even though I think that this is going to be about a 3.75 rounded up to a 4-star read for me. I will be continuing the series, albeit apprehensively, cautiously, dare I say, hopefully. All right, well, thanks for watching, and until next time.